The widowed rancher stopped the wagon in the middle of the frozen road when he saw what she was holding in her lap. The horses snorted white into the dark while Roslyn sat stiff beside him. One hand pressed over the dented metal lockbox she had dragged from the riverbank herself. Somewhere below the ice, water cracked like distant gunfire. Elias looked at the box, then at her trembling gloves, and for the first time since she arrived at Mercer Hollow Ranch, he forgot to hide what was in his face. What do you think was inside the lockbox? Roslyn Bennett heard her name before she heard the whole debt. She was standing outside the tack room, behind her uncle's small ranch near Miles City, Montana, holding a pail of cracked corn against her hip while the morning wind pushed dust through the yard. Inside, the tack room door hung open just enough for voices to carry. On the scarred table lay a feed store invoice from Red Creek Supply, folded twice beside a cracked blue coffee mug stained dark around the rim. Her uncle, Vernon Bennett, sounded smaller than usual. "I can't clear it before winter," he said, "not with cattle prices falling and that north fence still down." Across from him stood Elias Mercer, the widowed rancher from Mercer Hollow. Roslyn had seen him only twice before, always at a distance, a tall man in a dark coat with a hat brim, pulled low, and a face that seemed built for weather. He did not answer quickly. That silence made the dust in the room feel heavier. "I came for an answer," Elias said at last, "not to strip a man bare." Vernon rubbed both hands over his face. "There's work she can do. Roslyn keeps books better than I ever did. She can cook, mend, read receipts. A year at your place, maybe less, and we call the balance settled." The pail shifted in Roslyn's hands. For one hard breath, she felt like a line written under a column of numbers. Not a niece, not a woman with her own road ahead, just a way to keep a ranch from closing before the cold months came down. Elias's voice changed. "Did she agree to that?" Vernon said nothing. Roslyn stepped into the doorway before shame could push her backward. Both men turned. Her uncle's eyes dropped first. Elias held still, but not like a man caught doing wrong. More like a man who wished the wrong thing had never been placed before him. "I heard enough," Roslyn said. Vernon swallowed. "Roslyn, I was going to explain." "No," she said. "You were going to wait until explaining made no difference." The old walls held the silence. Elias reached for his hat from the table, slow and careful. "Miss Bennett, I won't take you under terms you don't choose." That should have made her feel safer. Instead, it made her throat ache. Roslyn looked past them toward the yard, where the horses stood with their backs to the wind, and the laundry line snapped against two leaning posts. If Vernon lost the place, 3 hired hands would lose winter work, and her aunt's grave beyond the cottonwoods would be left on land no Bennett could visit without permission. She set the pail down. "I'll go," she said. Her uncle looked up too fast. Elias did not. "I said I'll go," Roslyn repeated. "But don't speak of me like payment again." Vernon's mouth trembled around words that never came. Elias gave one small nod, the kind a man gave when he understood a boundary had been laid and meant to last. By noon, Roslyn had packed 1 canvas bag, 2 dresses, her mother's worn Bible, and a little tin of sewing needles wrapped in cloth. She did not cry when she climbed into Elias's wagon. Crying would have made everyone feel better except her. The ride north along County Road 19 was dry and cold. The wagon wheels crossed frozen ruts with a dull wooden knock, and Elias's saddle straps creaked each time his horse shifted beside the team. He did not fill the silence with false comfort. For that, Roslyn was almost grateful. Miles City fell behind them by degrees. First the smoke, then the church steeple, then the last pale roofs tucked low against the prairie wind. Roslyn kept her gloved hands folded in her lap and watched the land open wider than any room she had ever been allowed to stand in. Once, Elias glanced toward her as if meaning to speak, then looked back to the road. He let the quiet stay. Near sundown, cottonwoods appeared along a shallow draw, their bare limbs black against the sky. Beyond them stood Mercer Hollow Ranch, weathered but steady, with a long barn, a sagging corral gate, and yellow light burning in one kitchen window. Elias stopped the wagon near the porch and stepped down first. He came around to her side, lifted one hand, then paused before reaching farther. The space he left was small, but Rosalind noticed it. She looked at his hand. Then she took it. His grip was firm, warm through the glove, and gone the moment her boots touched the ground. No claim, no hurry, no show of kindness meant to be admired. Rosalind looked toward the house, then back at Elias Mercer. For the first time that day, anger was not the only thing holding her upright. Something quieter had taken its place, something she did not yet trust. And that unsettled her more than anger would have. The front door of Mercer Hollow Ranch opened with a low scrape against the floorboards. Warm air drifted out, carrying the smell of coffee grounds, lamp oil, and dry cedar smoke. Rosalind stepped inside carefully, her boots leaving faint dust prints across the entry rug, while Elias closed the door behind them. Against the evening wind rolling down from the Yellowstone River breaks. The house was larger than her uncle's place, but not grand, not polished either. A heavy wool coat hung beside the kitchen door as though someone had removed it only yesterday. Near the staircase sat a sewing basket with loose blue thread still wound through a needle. On the narrow table beneath the front window rested a weathered church ledger from Trinity Plains Chapel, with dried wildflowers pressed between its pages so long the petals had nearly turned transparent. Rosalind noticed all it. People left themselves behind in rooms without meaning to. "You'll have the room at the end of the hall," Elias said. "The stove keeps heat there better than the others." His voice stayed formal, almost careful. "Not cold, just measured." Rosalind nodded once and followed him upstairs. The bedroom was plain but clean, with a brass wash basin, 2 quilts folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and a small lamp trimmed low against the dark. Her canvas bag already looked too small, sitting beside the wardrobe. Elias stopped near the doorway instead of entering fully. "If anything's missing, tell me," he said. "Mrs. Delaney brings supplies in from Miles City on Thursdays." Rosalind waited for more explanation. None came. After a moment, Elias touched the brim of his hat lightly and stepped back into the hallway. His boots faded across the floorboards below until only the wind remained moving around the barn outside. That first supper passed mostly in silence. Elias ate slowly at one end of the table, while Rosalind sat across from him beneath the hanging oil lamp. The ticking clock near the pantry sounded louder than their forks against the plates. Once Elias reached automatically for a second cup near the stove before stopping halfway there. He looked at the empty place setting for one long second. Then he sat back down. Rosalind lowered her eyes and pretended not to notice. The days settled into a quiet rhythm after that. Elias left before sunrise most mornings, checking fences or riding pasture lines before the frost softened. Rosalind cleaned the kitchen, aired blankets, sorted pantry shelves, and slowly learned how the ranch moved through its hours. Mercer Hollow was isolated enough that evening wind could be heard slipping through gaps in the barn walls long after supper ended. One morning, before daylight, Rosalind came downstairs, wrapped in her shawl, and found Elias kneeling beside a loose kitchen chair with a screwdriver in one hand. He still wore his heavy wool coat, because the stove had not fully warmed the room yet. A lantern burned low beside him, throwing pale gold across the floorboards. "You could left that for me," Rosalind said quietly. Elias tightened the last screw before answering. "Chair nearly gave way yesterday. That still doesn't mean you had to fix it before dawn." Something almost like amusement crossed his fat face, gone before she could be certain it had been there. "I was awake already," he said. Short answer, plain voice, but not dismissive. Later that evening, Rosalind noticed Elias barely touched his supper before pushing the plate aside and returning to the study with a stack of papers under one arm. Long after midnight, light still glowed beneath the door. The next morning, she placed half a biscuit beside his untouched coffee cup before beginning the wash. Neither of them mentioned it. But when she returned to the kitchen later, the plate was empty. A few days after the first snow dusted the fence posts white, Rosalind entered the study searching for spare lamp oil. Beneath the desk she found freight records stacked unevenly beside a dented storage box. Several pages had numbers crossed out and rewritten in different ink. Shipment totals from the Northern Prairie Rail Depot did not match the cattle counts listed farther back in the ledger. Rosalind sat down slowly. Outside, wind pressed softly against the windows, while somewhere beyond the barn, a gate struck wood in a steady rhythm. She read the numbers again, and this time, she was certain something at Mercer Hollow Ranch was not adding up the way it should. The freight records from Northern Prairie Rail Depot had been stacked carelessly beneath the study desk, tied together with faded green string and pushed half behind a dented metal lockbox. Rosalind sat in Elias's chair, while wind moved softly against the window panes, comparing shipment weights against cattle counts written farther back in the ranch ledger. 3 head missing here, 4 there. Not enough to ruin a ranch quickly, enough to bleed one slowly. When Elias came in from the barns that evening, cold air followed him through the doorway, along with the sharp smell of horse sweat and snow. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time while Rosalind turned the papers toward him across the desk. "You're losing cattle somewhere between loading and delivery," she said. Elias glanced down at the figures. "Winter shortages." "No." Rosalind shook her head once. The shipment weights were altered after the cattle left the ranch. He studied her face before looking back at the pages. For a long moment he said nothing at all. The lamp beside them hissed softly in the quiet. Finally he pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat down. "Show me." That word changed something. Over the next week they traveled together more often than either expected. Elias hitched the wagon before dawn, while Rosalind carried ledgers wrapped in cloth against the cold. They rode west toward grazing parcels, holding pens, and auction yards scattered beyond Miles City, where cattle changed hands faster than trust ever did. The roads were rough with frozen ruts. At Dry Creek Station they spent nearly an hour, checking shipment tallies against rail receipts, while steam drifted from nearby engines into the gray afternoon sky. Rosalind noticed 2 entries signed in different handwriting, though both carried the same depot clerk's name. Elias noticed her noticing. "You catch details most people miss," he said quietly as they stepped back outside. Rosalind tucked her hands beneath her shawl against the wind. Most Botel's people don't expect women to read numbers carefully. Something unreadable crossed his face then. The farther west they traveled, the more Elias asked her opinion before speaking his own. Feed routes, delayed shipments, grazing schedules near the lower pasture. He no longer phrased questions carefully, as though afraid she might disappear if addressed too directly. Instead, he simply asked. One afternoon outside Dry Creek Station, the wind turned bitter enough to cut through wool. Rosalind's hands trembled while she tried fastening the top button of her coat beside the wagon wheel. Elias noticed without comment. He removed his gloves, stepped closer, and wrapped the loose end of her scarf tighter around her neck himself. His hands were rough from cold leather and rains. "There," he said softly. "You'll freeze otherwise." Rosalind looked up before she could stop herself. Their eyes held for one brief second longer than necessary. Not romance, not yet. Just the strange feeling of being looked after without being diminished by it. Elias stepped back first. Later that week, they attended a cattle meeting at Granger Feed Hall, near the rail crossing south of town. Ranchers crowded the long room smelling of wet coats, tobacco smoke, and thawing mud tracked across the floorboards. Rosalind stood beside Elias reviewing transport lists, while several men argued over feed shortages near the western routes. One rancher named Boyd Talmer glanced toward her and lowered his voice just enough to remain insulting. "You trust bookkeeping to temporary help now." The room shifted quieter around them. Rosalind kept her eyes on the papers. Years of restraint held her still better than pride ever had, but before she could answer, Elias folded the ledger shut with calm precision. She manages half this ranch better than I do, he said evenly. No raised voice, no anger. That made it land harder. Talmer muttered something into his coffee and looked away first. Conversation resumed slowly after that, but differently now. Men who had ignored Rosalind earlier began handing her freight slips directly, instead of sliding them past her toward Elias. The ride home stretched long beneath a pale winter sky. Wagon wheels rolled steady through snow packed thin across County Road 19, while the horses breathed clouds into the cold evening air. Rosalind kept her gloves folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Elias drove in silence for nearly a mile before speaking. You should heard that from me sooner, he said. Rosalind turned slightly toward him. Heard what? That you belong at the table when ranch matters are discussed. The reins creaked softly in his hands after that. Neither of them spoke again for a while, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. Winter settled harder over eastern Montana after the new year. Snow gathered along fence posts and drifted against the lower barn doors until ranch hands carried shovels beside feed sacks each morning. Mercer Hollow Ranch moved carefully through the season, measuring grain, watching water troughs freeze overnight, waiting for the final grazing payment that would secure spring pasture rights beyond the Tongue River. Then the freight wagon failed to arrive. By the second evening, Elias stood in the study beside the cold stove reading the same telegram twice beneath the lamplight. The shipment carrying payroll funds and signed grazing contracts had stopped somewhere near the river crossing east of Black Ash Ridge after axle trouble on the ice road. We can't wait another day, he said quietly. Rosalind looked up from the ledger table. You're riding out tonight? Before dawn. His voice sounded steady enough. His hands did not. While Elias folded the telegram, his fingers trembled once against the paper before closing into a fist. It lasted only a second, but Rosalind saw it. Over the last weeks, she had watched him push through long rides, skipped meals and cold nights without complaint. The strain sat deeper now, beneath the skin and behind the eyes. You're sick, she said. I'm tired. That isn't the same thing. Elias gave the smallest shake of his head, as if the conversation itself required more energy than he wanted to spend. The ranch still needs that wagon. Before sunrise the next morning, Rosalind heard the stable doors open through the dark. She dressed quickly, pulled on her wool coat, and stepped outside into air, sharp enough to sting her lungs. Snow creaked beneath her boots while Elias tightened the saddle straps beside the lantern hanging near the barn wall. You shouldn't be out here, he said without turning. Neither should you. That almost earned a tired smile. Rosalind saddled the second horse before he could argue further. Elias watched her for a long moment, the cold wind moving loose snow around their boots. I may not ride fast today, he admitted finally. It was the closest thing to weakness she had ever heard from him. The road toward Black Ash Ridge narrowed beneath sheets of old ice and wind-packed snow. Cottonwoods along the Tongue River bent low under the weather, while the horses picked careful footing through frozen ruts. Near midday, they found the freight wagon tilted hard beside the river trail. One axle split clean through near the wheel hub. A broken wagon lantern swung slowly from a bent iron hook, tapping metal against wood whenever the wind rose. The driver had already taken shelter farther south, leaving the locked strongbox and contract satchel beneath heavy canvas in the wagon bed. Elias climbed down stiffly from the saddle, one hand briefly catching the wagon rail for balance before he straightened again. Rosalind pretended not to notice. Together they unloaded what they could before darkness settled fully across the ridge. The horses grew uneasy near the riverbank, where ice cracked softly beneath the current below. Once, a sharp sound split through the stillness and both animals jerked hard against their reins. Easy, Elias murmured, stepping closer to calm them. His voice nearly gave out halfway through the word. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast enough to numb fingers through gloves. Elias managed to build a small fire beside the wagon, while Rosalind wrapped blankets around the strong box to keep moisture from reaching the papers inside. Snow moved sideways through the trees beyond the ridgeline. For a while, they sat without speaking. Then Elias leaned back against the wagon wheel and closed his eyes only for a moment. Rosalind watched the strain finally loosen from his face once sleep reached him. Fever had settled there quietly, hidden beneath stubbornness and routine. She reached for the edge of his coat and pulled it higher around his shoulders before the wind shifted colder. Elias stirred slightly, but did not wake. Rosalind stayed awake through most of the night, feeding branches into the fire, one at a time, while the river ice groaned somewhere beyond the dark. Every so often she looked toward him just to make certain his breathing still sounded steady. At dawn, the stormlight softened enough to travel. The ride back toward Mercer Hollow Ranch passed mostly in silence beneath a pale gray sky. Elias looked worn thinner somehow, but he kept his horse close beside Rosalind's the entire journey home, never drifting ahead even when the trail widened. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither needed to. By early spring, the snow along the fence lines had thinned into dirty patches beneath the cottonwoods, and the roads leading toward Miles City no longer cracked with ice beneath wagon wheels. Mercer Hollow Ranch moved carefully back into motion after the hard winter months. Men repaired sagging gates. Feed bins were counted twice instead of once. Water ran steadily again through the shallow ditch behind the lower pasture. The freight theft scheme finally unraveled through the records. Rosalind had preserved inside the dented lockbox beneath the study desk shipment, totals, altered signatures, and mismatch rail. Receipts passed through enough hands in town that several depot clerks and suppliers quietly lost their contracts before planting season arrived. No one celebrated openly. People simply stopped pretending not to see what had happened. Life at Mercer Hollow settled afterward into smaller things. Supper dishes drying beside the sink. Mud scraped from boots at the kitchen door. Elias studying grazing maps beneath the lamp while Rosalind copied figures neatly into the ranch ledger across from him. The tension that once filled every room loosened little by little until silence no longer felt like something waiting to break. Still, Rosalind remembered the original agreement. 1 year. Work in exchange for debt. Nothing more. Late one afternoon, she carried a small canvas case upstairs and began folding her dresses carefully inside it. Her mother's Bible went in last, wrapped in a shawl against the corners wearing through. Downstairs, the house creaked softly around its ordinary sounds while wind moved across the porch screens. Rosalind paused beside the study shelf before removing her books one at a time. That was where Elias found her. He stood in the doorway, holding a rolled grazing map beneath one arm, his coat still dusted pale from the south pasture road. At first, he looked only at the shelf itself, the empty spaces. Then his eyes moved to the canvas case resting open on the bed. "You're packing," he said quietly. Rosalind smoothed a wrinkle from one folded sleeve before answering. The debts settled. The room stayed still after that. Elias stepped farther inside, slower than usual, as though one wrong movement might send the conversation somewhere neither of them could pull back from. He set the grazing map carefully on the dresser beside her sewing tin. "I treated you like an obligation when you first arrived here," he said. "You deserved better than that." Rosalind looked up then. Most men she had known apologized quickly, mostly to escape discomfort. Elias sounded different. Tired, maybe. Honest in the way people only became after carrying the same silence too long. "You didn't owe me kindness," she said. That wasn't the problem. The words settled heavily between them. Downstairs, somewhere near the kitchen, the screen tapped once in the wind and fell quiet again. Elias rested one hand against the bedpost, eyes lowered briefly before returning to hers. "This stopped feeling temporary a long time ago," he said. Rosalind felt something tighten painfully in her chest, then loosen just as slowly. Over the winter, she had prepared herself for many endings. Leaving had been the safest one to believe in. She glanced toward the open suitcase beside her knee, then toward Elias standing there in the fading afternoon, light looking less like the distant rancher who had brought her north along County Road 19, and more like a man uncertain of what would happen if she walked away. On the kitchen table below them rested a hand-drawn spring grazing map, weighted flat beneath Elias's old horseshoe hammer. 2 cups still sat beside it from the coffee they had shared that morning, without thinking to call it routine. Rosalind crossed the room slowly and placed one hand over the unfinished map instead of reaching for the suitcase again. Elias watched her fingers settle against the paper. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then something eased visibly in his face, small enough another person might have missed it entirely. That evening's supper was simple: beans, bread warmed again in the oven, coffee strong enough to carry through the last cold nights before spring fully arrived. Elias pulled out Rosalind's chair before sitting down himself, not formally now, simply from habit. Outside, the porch light remained burning long after the dishes had been cleared away. Not because anyone was expected home, only because neither of them felt alone enough to turn it off anymore. Sometimes the people who change our lives don't arrive with grand promises. Sometimes they simply stay, quietly, day after day, until one evening the house no longer feels empty. If this story stayed with you, leave a simple 1 in the comments. And if you believe loyalty matters more than perfect beginnings, leave a home. Don't forget to subscribe and come back for the next story from the American frontier, where love is rarely loud but always earned.